There comes a moment in every battle where the strongest weapon suddenly becomes useless, not because the weapon has changed, but because the person standing on the other side has. A narcissist depends on predictable reactions. They rely on fear, confusion, guilt, and emotional exhaustion to keep others under their influence. Every conversation is designed to pull someone into a cycle where they question themselves while the narcissist appears to remain in control. For a long time, this strategy may seem unstoppable. It works because most people naturally seek peace, understanding, and reconciliation. They assume that honesty will be met with honesty and kindness with kindness. But when a narcissist finally meets someone who understands the game and refuses to participate, everything begins to change. The narcissist's greatest weapon has never been intelligence, charm, or confidence. It has always been the ability to provoke emotional reactions. Every angry response, every desperate explanation, every attempt to prove innocence becomes another opportunity for manipulation. They study emotions the way a hunter studies patterns. They know when someone feels guilty, insecure, lonely, or afraid, and they use those emotions as leverage. The more emotionally invested the other person becomes, the stronger the narcissist appears. They thrive in chaos because chaos distracts people from seeing the truth. Imagine someone trying to pull you into an argument that never ends. Every answer you give becomes another accusation. Every explanation is twisted into another misunderstanding. Every attempt to defend yourself somehow becomes evidence against you. It feels like running on a treadmill. You are exhausted, yet you never move forward. That endless cycle is not an accident. It is carefully maintained because confusion keeps people dependent. When you are constantly defending yourself, you stop questioning the person creating the conflict in the first place. But something remarkable happens when a person begins to recognize these patterns. They stop asking, "How do I make this person understand me?" Instead, they begin asking, "Why am I constantly explaining myself to someone who has no desire to understand?" That single shift changes everything. It redirects attention from pleasing the narcissist to protecting one's own peace. The battle is no longer about winning an argument. It becomes about refusing to enter one that was designed to be unwinnable. A narcissist expects emotional fuel. They anticipate tears, anger, panic, frustration, or desperate attempts to fix the relationship. These reactions reassure them that they still hold influence. Every emotional outburst confirms that they can still reach into another person's heart and pull the strings. But when those reactions disappear, something unexpected happens. Their usual tactics begin to lose effectiveness. The words that once caused panic now fall flat. The accusations that once created anxiety no longer provoke endless explanations. Silence becomes stronger than argument. This does not happen because the person has become cold or uncaring. It happens because wisdom replaces impulsive emotion. They begin to understand that not every accusation deserves a response. Not every lie requires correction. Not every conflict deserves participation. Strength often looks quieter than people expect. Sometimes the strongest response is simply refusing to surrender your peace to someone determined to steal it. One of the most frustrating experiences for a narcissist is encountering someone who has learned emotional discipline. They may try new strategies. They may become unusually charming one day and unexpectedly cruel the next. They may attempt guilt, pity, flattery, or intimidation. These changing tactics are not signs of genuine transformation. They are often attempts to discover which button still works. But when every button has been disconnected, frustration begins to replace confidence. Many people mistakenly believe that power belongs to the loudest voice in the room. In reality, lasting power belongs to the person who controls their own emotions. A narcissist may control conversations, manipulate opinions, and influence circumstances for a season, but they cannot easily control someone who knows their own worth. Confidence rooted in truth is difficult to manipulate because it does not depend on another person's approval. This transformation rarely happens overnight. It is usually the result of painful lessons, repeated disappointments, and countless moments of self-reflection. A person gradually realizes that constantly proving their goodness to someone committed to misunderstanding them is a battle with no finish line. They stop measuring their value by another person's opinion. Instead, they begin measuring their choices by integrity, wisdom, and inner peace. As emotional independence grows, fear begins to shrink. The fear of rejection loses its grip. The fear of criticism becomes less overwhelming. Even the fear of being misunderstood starts to fade because the person no longer needs universal approval to know who they are. That freedom is something manipulation cannot easily penetrate. When identity is anchored in truth instead of validation, emotional control becomes increasingly impossible. Ironically, the narcissist often becomes more desperate precisely when they sense their influence fading. They may intensify accusations, create unnecessary drama, rewrite history, or seek attention from new sources. These actions often reveal what was hidden before. The mask begins to slip because manipulation requires cooperation. Without someone willing to carry the emotional burden, the performance becomes much harder to maintain. The greatest weapon stops working because it was never truly powerful on its own. It depended entirely on another person's participation. Once that participation ends, the illusion of control begins to collapse. The narcissist may still speak the same words, use the same tactics, and repeat the same patterns, but they no longer produce the same results. The cycle is broken not through revenge, louder arguments, or proving someone wrong, but through the quiet decision to no longer surrender emotional authority. That is why the moment a narcissist finally meets their match is rarely dramatic. There may be no applause, no public victory, and no final confrontation. The real victory happens inside the heart of the person who has learned that peace is more valuable than winning every argument, that wisdom is stronger than emotional impulse, and that true freedom begins the moment you stop giving someone else the power to define your worth. In that quiet strength, the narcissist's greatest weapon loses the only thing that ever made it effective: your willingness to keep fighting a battle designed to keep you trapped. One of the most surprising moments in any relationship marked by manipulation is discovering that emotional detachment is not the same as becoming heartless. Many people fear that creating emotional distance means they have stopped caring, become bitter, or abandoned their compassion. The truth is almost the opposite. Emotional detachment is not about shutting down your heart. It is about refusing to allow someone else to control it. It is the quiet decision to protect your inner peace instead of placing it in the hands of someone who repeatedly uses your emotions as a tool for control. When a narcissist finally meets someone who understands this difference, the entire dynamic begins to change in ways they never expected. For a long time, the narcissist has learned to depend on emotional reactions. Every tear, every angry response, every desperate attempt to explain, and every plea to be understood becomes proof that they still have influence. They know that emotions can cloud judgment. When someone is overwhelmed with guilt, fear, anxiety, or frustration, they become easier to manipulate because they are focused on escaping the emotional pain rather than recognizing who is creating it. The narcissist often counts on this pattern repeating itself over and over again. That is why emotional detachment becomes such a powerful turning point. It interrupts the pattern. Instead of reacting immediately, a person begins to pause. They stop allowing every accusation to become a personal emergency. They stop believing they must defend themselves against every criticism. They begin to recognize that not every statement deserves an answer, and not every conflict deserves participation. This change may appear small from the outside, but internally it represents an enormous shift in perspective. Imagine standing in the middle of a storm. At first, every gust of wind pushes you in a different direction. Every loud sound demands your attention. Every wave threatens to knock you down. But eventually, you learn how to plant your feet firmly. The wind may continue blowing, but it no longer determines where you stand. Emotional detachment creates that same stability. The chaos around you may not disappear immediately, but it no longer dictates your thoughts, your decisions, or your sense of identity. This kind of strength does not develop overnight. Most people arrive at emotional detachment after experiencing repeated disappointment. They have spent countless hours trying to explain themselves, hoping that honesty would change someone's behavior. They believed that if they were patient enough, loving enough, or understanding enough, everything would improve. Instead, they found themselves trapped in endless cycles where every solution led to another problem. Eventually, they realized that the issue was not their inability to communicate. The issue was that they were communicating with someone who often had little interest in mutual understanding. Once this realization settles into the heart, priorities begin to change. Instead of asking, "How can I make this person see my value?" they begin asking, "Why am I giving someone the authority to decide my value in the first place?" That single question creates remarkable freedom. It shifts attention away from earning approval and toward preserving self-respect. The need for constant validation slowly fades because confidence begins growing from within instead of depending on someone else's opinion. A narcissist often finds this transformation deeply unsettling because emotional detachment removes the fuel that once kept the relationship under their control. Manipulation depends on emotional urgency. If every disagreement feels like a crisis, the manipulator maintains influence. But when the other person remains calm, thinks carefully before responding, and refuses to become emotionally overwhelmed, those familiar tactics begin losing their effectiveness. This calmness should never be mistaken for weakness. In fact, remaining emotionally steady often requires far greater strength than reacting impulsively. Anyone can speak in anger when emotions overflow. It takes discipline to remain composed while being misunderstood. It takes wisdom to recognize that silence is sometimes more powerful than another argument. It takes courage to walk away from conversations designed only to create confusion rather than understanding. The narcissist may respond to this new behavior by increasing pressure. They might become unusually charming, offering compliments and promises they rarely expressed before. When that fails, they may become more critical, hoping fear will replace affection as a source of control. They may rewrite history, deny previous actions, or accuse the other person of being cold and uncaring simply because they are no longer reacting emotionally. These sudden shifts often reveal that the goal was never healthy communication. The goal was maintaining influence. Someone practicing emotional detachment begins recognizing these patterns without immediately becoming consumed by them. Instead of chasing every contradiction, they observe it. Instead of feeling responsible for fixing every misunderstanding, they allow others to take responsibility for their own choices. Instead of carrying guilt that does not belong to them, they learn to distinguish between genuine accountability and manufactured shame. This clarity becomes one of the greatest forms of protection. Healthy emotional detachment also changes the way a person views conflict itself. They no longer measure success by winning every disagreement. They understand that some arguments have no genuine solution because they were never intended to produce one. Some conversations exist only to create exhaustion, confusion, or self-doubt. Refusing to participate is not surrender. It is recognizing that wisdom sometimes means conserving your energy for battles that actually matter. As inner peace grows, fear begins losing its grip. Criticism no longer destroys confidence because confidence is no longer built upon another person's approval. Rejection becomes less devastating because identity is rooted in personal values instead of external validation. The emotional highs and lows that once controlled daily life gradually level out into a steadier sense of purpose. This stability makes manipulation increasingly difficult because there are fewer emotional openings through which control can enter. Perhaps the greatest transformation is that emotional detachment creates room for genuine relationships to flourish. When a person is no longer consumed by constant emotional turmoil, they have greater capacity to invest in people who offer mutual respect, honesty, encouragement, and trust. Their energy is no longer spent surviving endless cycles of manipulation. Instead, it is invested in growth, healing, wisdom, and meaningful connections. The narcissist often mistakes this peaceful confidence for indifference because they cannot understand why their usual tactics no longer produce familiar results. But the truth is much deeper. Emotional detachment is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of self-control. It is choosing wisdom over impulse, clarity over confusion, and peace over endless emotional conflict. It is discovering that the strongest person in the room is often not the loudest, the most aggressive, or the most persuasive, but the one who refuses to let another person's behavior determine the condition of their own heart. Before moving to the next point, it's helpful to remember that this is an inspirational, motivational reflection. It discusses behaviors often associated with manipulative relationships and should not be interpreted as describing every individual with narcissistic traits. One of the greatest fears of a narcissist is not being criticized, rejected, or even exposed in public. It is the moment when someone begins to see through the carefully constructed image they have worked so hard to maintain. Every manipulative relationship depends on a version of reality that benefits the manipulator. Facts become flexible, conversations are rewritten, intentions are distorted, and memories are questioned until the other person begins to doubt what they know to be true. This is why truth becomes so powerful. It does not need to shout. It does not need to argue endlessly. It simply remains consistent, and over time, consistency has a way of exposing every mask that deception tries to wear. In the beginning, manipulation is rarely obvious. It often arrives wrapped in charm, confidence, affection, or promises that seem sincere. The narcissist understands that trust must usually be earned before it can be exploited. They present themselves as someone who deserves admiration and loyalty, carefully creating an image that others find difficult to question. Their words may sound convincing, their confidence may appear genuine, and their explanations may seem reasonable. Because of this, the people around them often ignore small warning signs, believing that every misunderstanding has an innocent explanation. As time passes, however, patterns begin to emerge. Small inconsistencies become larger contradictions. Promises are repeatedly broken, while excuses become increasingly creative. Accountability is constantly redirected towards someone else. Every conflict somehow becomes another person's fault. Every mistake is minimized, denied, or justified. At first, these incidents may appear isolated, but eventually they begin forming a picture that is impossible to ignore. Truth does not always reveal itself in a single dramatic moment. More often, it appears piece by piece until the entire puzzle suddenly makes sense. One of the most common tools used by a narcissist is confusion. Confusion weakens confidence because people who doubt their own perception become easier to influence. A person may clearly remember a conversation, only to be told it never happened. They may recall hurtful words, only to hear that they are too sensitive or imagining things. They may question broken promises, only to be accused of being demanding or unforgiving. After enough of these experiences, they begin wondering whether their own memory can be trusted. This is precisely where manipulation gains strength. When people stop trusting themselves, they begin relying on the manipulator to define reality for them. But there comes a moment when something changes. Instead of accepting every explanation without question, a person begins paying attention to repeated patterns rather than isolated events. They stop focusing only on what is being said and begin noticing what is consistently being done. They recognize that genuine character is revealed through actions repeated over time, not impressive speeches delivered in emotional moments. This quiet observation becomes one of the greatest enemies of manipulation because patterns cannot remain hidden forever. Truth has a remarkable quality that deception lacks. It remains steady. Lies often require constant adjustment because one falsehood must be protected by another. Stories become increasingly complicated. Details begin changing. Contradictions multiply. The narcissist spends enormous energy maintaining an image that does not naturally exist. Meanwhile, truth requires no performance. It remains the same regardless of who is watching. As clarity grows, emotional dependence begins to weaken. The person no longer feels compelled to defend themselves against every accusation because they recognize that many accusations were never intended to uncover truth. They were designed to create distraction. Instead of asking, "How do I convince this person that I'm right?" they begin asking, "Why am I trying so hard to convince someone who repeatedly ignores evidence?" That question marks the beginning of emotional freedom. The narcissist often expects people to remain focused on isolated incidents rather than recurring behavior. They count on short memories. They rely on emotional intensity to overshadow consistency. A dramatic apology today is meant to erase repeated disrespect from yesterday. An affectionate gesture tomorrow is expected to cancel months of manipulation. But when someone starts evaluating character through long-term patterns instead of temporary emotions, the illusion becomes much harder to maintain. This awakening does not necessarily produce anger. In fact, it often produces remarkable calmness. There's a quiet confidence that develops when confusion finally gives way to understanding. Questions that once created anxiety now have clear answers. Behaviors that once seemed unpredictable suddenly make sense. The person stops blaming themselves for problems they never created. They realize that many of the emotional battles they fought were carefully designed to keep them distracted from recognizing the deeper issue. One of the most significant changes is that truth restores self-trust. For a long time, manipulation teaches people to ignore their instincts. They explain away warning signs, they dismiss uncomfortable feelings, they silence their own intuition because they fear being unfair or judgmental. But as truth becomes clearer, they begin listening to that inner wisdom again. They learn that discernment is not cruelty. Recognizing unhealthy behavior is not the same as condemning another person's worth. It is simply acknowledging reality without allowing wishful thinking to replace it. The narcissist often becomes increasingly uncomfortable when they realize their usual strategies are no longer working. They may attempt to create new distractions, involve other people, invent fresh conflicts, or intensify emotional pressure. Sometimes they present themselves as the victim. Other times they become unusually charming, hoping kindness will erase accountability. These rapid shifts are often signs that the carefully maintained image is becoming more difficult to protect. When truth is consistently recognized, manipulation loses one of its greatest advantages. There is something deeply liberating about no longer needing to argue with reality. The person stops exhausting themselves trying to reconcile words that never match actions. They stop expecting honesty from someone committed to deception. They stop sacrificing peace in pursuit of explanations that never truly satisfy. Instead, they allow consistent behavior to speak louder than persuasive language. This shift creates stability because decisions are now based on observable reality rather than emotional promises. Perhaps the greatest power of truth is that it restores personal identity. Manipulation slowly convinces people that they are the problem, that their emotions are unreasonable, and that their expectations are unrealistic. Truth gently removes those false labels. It reminds them that their perceptions matter, their experiences are real, and their voice deserves to be heard. They no longer depend on the narcissist to define who they are because they have rediscovered the confidence that comes from seeing reality clearly. When a narcissist finally meets someone who refuses to ignore patterns, refuses to abandon truth for temporary comfort, and refuses to surrender their perception to constant manipulation, every carefully constructed mask begins to lose its power. The image that once appeared flawless becomes increasingly difficult to maintain because truth does what deception never can. It remains consistent, patient, and unshakable. In the end, it is not louder arguments or greater force that expose the mask. It is the quiet strength of a person who chooses to trust what is consistently true, allowing reality itself to reveal what manipulation worked so hard to hide.